Hasn't the Bible been copied and changed over centuries? Didn't powerful people edit it to control others? What about contradictions? What about missing books? Wasn't it written long after the events actually happened? Why trust the Bible over other religious texts? And isn't faith basically believing without evidence? If you've asked any of those questions, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not crazy. You are not faithless. And you are not alone. Today, we're not going to dodge those questions. We're going to walk straight through them carefully, honestly, and without pretending the Bible needs us to protect it. If the Bible is unreliable, then Christianity collapses into preference, tradition, or vibes. But if the Bible is reliable, even at a basic historical level, then Jesus' claims confront us personally. So today, we're asking really one big question, and that is, can we trust the Bible? Not just devotionally, but historically. And we'll walk through it a few key ways: how it was written and preserved, whether it was changed, what archaeology says, what prophecy actually means, and why this book keeps enduring and transforming lives. When people say, I don't trust the Bible, they usually mean one of two things. Either A, I don't trust how it was transmitted, or B, I don't trust it, I don't trust its claims about reality. So let's start with transmission. One of the questions behind the skepticism is, isn't the Bible just a bunch of disconnected religious ideas kind of stitched together? So here's what we're dealing with. The Bible was written by over 40 authors across 1,500 years on 3 continents and in 3 languages. That's Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Those authors included shepherds, kings, prophets, fishermen, tax collectors, and scholars. Now, normally that kind of diversity produces contradiction and fragmentation, but instead, the Bible tells one coherent story: creation, fall, redemption, restoration. I'm going to say it again for the cheap seats. Creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Now, let me be careful. Unity alone doesn't prove divine inspiration, but it raises a serious question. Why does this cohere at all? Especially when you compare it to other ancient collections like Greek mythology, which splinter into competing theologies and narratives. So already the idea that this is just a sloppy human invention doesn't quite fit the data. But let's keep going. This is probably the most common objection. How do we know the Bible hasn't been changed over time? All right, so here's how ancient texts survive. We don't have the originals really for any ancient work. What we have are hand-copied manuscripts. So the real question becomes, how many copies do we have? How early are they? And how well do they agree? All right, again, how many copies do we have? How early are they? In other words, how close to the original that they're copied from are they? And how well do these copies agree? Are these copies the same? Now, for the New Testament, we have 5,800 plus Greek manuscripts. We have 10,000 plus Latin manuscripts and 9,000 plus manuscripts in other ancient languages. That's nearly 20,000 copies. All right, now for comparison, Homer's Iliad has about 1,800 manuscripts. Plato has under 300 manuscripts. No other ancient text comes anywhere close. Now, Omar, why does that matter? Because numbers allow cross-checking. Again, if you had two copies and they disagreed, you'd be stuck guessing. But if you have thousands of copies, well, then patterns begin to emerge. And these manuscripts weren't all copied in one place. They spread across Rome, the Roman Empire, different regions, different languages. That means no central authority could quietly rewrite the text everywhere. So when we ask, has the Bible been changed? The answer is, it couldn't have been changed secretly, systematically, or successfully. Another hot button question. But aren't there variants and contradictions? Yes, there are textual variants. But here's what matters. Scholars estimate the New Testament is about 99.5% textually accurate. Let that sink in for a sec. 99.5% accuracy on the New Testament. I think the Old Testament is like 96%. I have to look that up, but I believe that's the OT. Anyway, most variants are spelling differences, word order changes, or minor grammatical issues. No core Christian doctrine depends on a disputed text. For the Old Testament, the Dead Sea Scrolls, gave us remarkable confirmation, right? So when the Isaiah scroll, for example, dated around 125 BC, was compared to copies from AD 1000, the text was virtually unchanged in substance. So when people say the Bible has changed or the Bible has been changed, what they usually mean is, I heard that once, not I've looked at the evidence. Textual criticism doesn't weaken Scripture. It's how we measure how well it's been preserved. All right, so let's get into archaeology. All right, because another question is the Bible just religious myth? All right. Archaeology can't prove theology, but it can confirm history. And over again, archaeology has done exactly that. The Pool of Bethesda in John 5, once doubted, excavated with 5 porticos, just as it is described. The Pilate inscription, this confirms that Pontius Pilate was in fact the prefect of Judea. The Hittite civilization, once dismissed as fictional, is now well documented. Archaeology doesn't prove God exists, but it consistently shows the Bible is talking about real people, real places, and real events. Another big objection. Isn't prophecy vague or cherry-picked? All right, some claims are overstated, and that's a fair point. But the messianic prophecies are different. All right, so let's put a quarter in the meter and park there for a sec. Jesus fulfills prophecies written centuries earlier. I'm going to say that again for the cheap seats. Jesus fulfills prophecies that were written about him centuries before. Micah 5:2, born in Bethlehem. Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. Psalm 22. Now here's one that I love. This Psalm 22 has crucifixion imagery before crucifixion itself existed. Zechariah 11, betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. Zechariah 9, triumphal entry on a donkey. All right, this is where I want us to slow down just a little bit because this part matters. A lot of people hear prophecy and immediately think that's vague, that's cherry-picked, that's just religious interpretation. So instead of starting with theology, let's start with math. There was a professor named Peter W. Stoner. He was a professor of mathematics and astronomy and later the chairman of science at Westmount College. He wasn't trying to preach. He was asking a technical question. What are the odds that one person could fulfill specific messianic prophecies purely by chance? Not all of them, not hundreds, just 8 of them. What are the odds that one person could fulfill 8 specific messianic prophecies purely by chance? Things like being born in Bethlehem, being betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, having that money thrown into the temple and used to buy a potter's field, being crucified, and being silent before his accusers. And Stoner did not work alone. His calculations were reviewed by the American Scientific Affiliation, a group of scientists, many of whom were not trying to defend Christianity. And they affirmed that his math was sound. Now, here's what he found. The odds of one person accidentally fulfilling just eight messianic prophecies is 1 in 100 quadrillion. Now, those numbers are meaningless until you visualize them. All right, so Stoner gave us an illustration. Imagine you take the entire state of Texas, you cover it 2 feet deep in silver dollars. You take one silver dollar and you mark one, like maybe you take one, you paint it red, and then you stir the entire pile. Again, this covers the totality of the state of Texas, 2 feet deep, silver dollars. Then you blindfold someone. They can walk anywhere in Texas. They get one chance to reach down and pick one coin. The odds that they pick the marked coin, that's the same odds as one person fulfilling 8 messianic prophecies by chance. And remember, 8 is a small sample size. Stoner went further. If you take 48 prophecies, the odds jump to 1 in 10 is a number I can't even say, 10 to the 157th power. That's not a number my brain can even hold. At that point, Stoner said it would be like finding one specific electron in an unimaginably vast universe of electrons. Now, hear me clearly on this. This does not prove Christianity the way a math equation proves gravity. But it obviously destroys the idea that Jesus just happened to fit the story. What we're dealing with is not random coincidence, it's convergence. Independent texts written centuries apart by different authors, all pointing towards the same figure. At some point, chance stops being a serious explanation. So when people say prophecy is vague or accidental, the real question becomes, at what point does coincidence stop being intellectually responsible? Which leads me to something very cool, but it can be abused if it's overstated. In the Old Testament, God reveals himself by covenant name, YHWH. Now in Hebrew, that's 4 consonants. The Y is Yod, the H is Hey, the W is Vav, sometimes Wav, and then H again for Hey. So you say it out loud, and it's Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey. Now keep in mind, I'm pronouncing the letters, not the divine name itself. Why? Because Yahweh, YHWH, itself was not traditionally spoken aloud in ancient Judaism. Out of reverence, the Jews would say Adonai or Hashem. Adonai means Lord, Hashem means the name. So scholars don't claim to know the original vocalization with any real certainty. And you heard me say Yahweh, you say, well, what about that? Well, you'll often hear Yahweh, and that's widely accepted by scholars as the most likely ancient pronunciation. What matters even more than how it's pronounced is how often it appears. This covenant name shows up over 6,800 times in the Hebrew scriptures. And it's not a title. It's not a generic word for God. It's God's personal covenantal name. The moment this name is revealed is critical, right? Exodus 3, when Moses asks God, who should I say sent me? God responds, I am who I am. Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. The phrase is tied directly to YHWH. It communicates existence, faithfulness, and self-sufficiency. God is not contingent. God is not created. God simply is. This is why later in Jewish tradition, the name became so holy it was rarely spoken aloud. Now, here's where the pictographs come in. And this is where we need to be careful. Early forms of Hebrew writing, often called Paleo-Hebrew, were influenced by pictograph scripts. Letters originally carried symbolic imagery. So, for example, we said Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey. The Y originally conveyed the idea of a hand or an arm. H was meant behold or look or reveal. The W meant nail or hook or peg, and the H again means behold. So when Christian apologists look back at the ancient pictograph forms of Yahweh, they sometimes note that the letter images can be poetically rendered as behold the hand, behold the nail. Now pause, because if you're like me, your mind is kind of blown by that. But let's chill, all right? This is not what ancient Israelites consciously meant when they wrote the name Yahweh, YHWH. They understood it as God's covenant name tied to I am. So while it is very, very dope to have, hand and nail, pointing to Christ, even in his covenant name, it is not linguistic proof. It is not hidden code. When we look back through the lens of Christ, especially in light of passages like Zechariah 12:10, they will look on me whom they have pierced, or Psalm 22:16, they pierced my hands and my feet. The imagery becomes very striking. It's really just one more way, though, that the Bible, across centuries, genres, and languages, seems to point forward to the same reality. And here's why that matters apologetically. The Bible doesn't just claim that Jesus fits prophecy. It claims that Jesus shares the identity of Yahweh. That's why Jesus says in John 8:58, before Abraham was, I am. That's why Paul says in Philippians 2 that every knee will bow and every tongue confess, language that was originally reserved for Yahweh. So even the covenant name of God, when viewed through the full arc of Scripture, points us toward Jesus Christ. Now, giving some of y'all this is like handing a credit card to a college student. So let me make sure that we all, drink responsibly here. This is not something we build our entire case on. It is not a mic drop argument. It's a reflection, not a foundation. But when you put it next to fulfilled prophecy, manuscript reliability, archaeological confirmation, thematic unity, it becomes one more thread in a very large tapestry. And that tapestry consistently points in one direction. Another question: why has this book lasted? Right? The Bible survived bans, burnings, and empires. It has been translated into 3,500 plus languages with billions of copies distributed. In fact, the YouVersion Bible app alone has over 500 million downloads. Now, influence doesn't equate to truth, but endurance at this scale demands our attention. And beyond influence, there's transformation. Across cultures and centuries, people testify to freedom, renewal, and moral change. Jesus invited this kind of test. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know. That's John 7:17. That is not blind faith. That is an invitation to practice and see. So we're going to end where we started. Can we trust the Bible? So let's take a look at what we've seen. Unity across diversity, manuscript evidence unmatched in antiquity, transmission accuracy verified, archaeology confirming historical claims, prophecy converging on Jesus, and endurance and transformation across history. This doesn't force belief, but it does mean this: the Bible is reliable enough, but it does mean this: the Bible is reliable enough to deserve a real hearing. You don't have to shut your brain off to follow Jesus. And the same scriptures that have been preserved, tested, and trusted across centuries are still inviting us not just to read them, but to actually respond.